The best way for me to describe this game is beautiful clarity. At some point, Bobby Fischer's opponent, Vasily Smyslov, by the way, both of these players were world champions over the course of their careers, plays an interesting move where he takes on a weakness that may or may not be a strength. And it is up to Bobby Fischer to determine whether it's a weakness or a strength. And I want you to watch the clear way Bobby Fischer is able to create a position that favors him and really strategically put the pressure on Smyslov. Fischer has white, Smyslov has black. This game was played in 1965 at the Capablanca Memorial Tournament in Havana, Cuba. Fischer begins with e4, e5, and very quickly we have Fischer's favorite Spanish opening on the board. a6, bishop to a4, no exchange variation today. Knight to f6, and here Fischer plays another move that's quite popular these days, d3. Not the sharper lines, but this is a little slower, just playing d3, creating a strong point at e4, and there's a little bit more maneuvering here, but there's still plenty of potential for attacking play. d6 from Smyslov, c3 from Fischer, so he may play d4 later. He needs to tuck the bishop at c2, he can do that. Knight b to d2, or bishop to e7 first from black. Knight b to d2. The traditional idea in this Spanish is that the knight at b1 will go to f1 and either pop up at g3 or e3. But notice Fischer has not yet castled. He wants to save a tempo on that maneuver because when you castle, you have to move your rook and then do it. So he's trying to save a little time after castling, then knight to f1. Plays that immediately. Smyslov responds with b5, bishop to b3, and then d5. Even though he's moved the d pawn once, he's trying to take advantage of the fact that Fischer has delayed castling and open up the center as quickly as possible while Fischer's king is still there. So d5 is definitely a good move. Queen to e2 from Fischer, adding some strength to the e4 pawn. He also wants to prevent the exchange of queens after an exchange on e4. DE4, DE4, and this is really the critical moment of the game already in the opening. Smyslov plays bishop to e6, challenging that very nice bishop of white's. In the Spanish, this light-squared bishop can be very strong. He's challenging it immediately, but he's also allowing Fischer to take on e6 and do some damage to his pawn structure, which Fischer does. Bishop takes, pawn takes. So why would a superstar, really, legendary chess player like Smyslov allow these doubled pawns? They're isolated, they're weak, but they also have their strengths. You'll notice this pawn keeps a knight out of f5 and d5. He also now has a half-open f file that he can work with, as well as the fully open d file. So there's dynamic compensation, but the pawns are still weak. So the play revolves around, can Fischer exploit this weakness, or will Smyslov be able to exploit these pawns as a strength? Knight to g3 from Fischer. He has to move the knight because he has to clear the way to castle, even though the knight will not be able to land on f5. Queen to d7, castles, and rook a to d8. Smyslov immediately moves to control the d file. Fischer plays a4. This is a thematic idea in the Spanish. Basically, black has gained space on the queen side, which is good, but these pawns can become a target, and Fischer is creating a target on b5. Smyslov plays queen to d3, so the queen will no longer attack the b5 pawn, but with queens off, now these pawns might become a little more vulnerable. The dynamic element of those pawns is reduced with queens off. Queen takes, rook takes, ab5, ab5. So Smyslov has the d file, but Fischer has the a file. Rook to a6, attacking the knight and putting some x-ray pressure on the e6 pawn. The rook comes back to d6, and here's an interesting move from Fischer. He plays the move king to h1, which seems sort of nonsensical. Well, why does he do that? There's actually a very clear tactical reason. Smyslov is threatening to play knight to d4 here, revealing an attack on the rook at a6, and after rook d6, Smyslov would have the intermediate move, knight takes f3 check, because the king is on g1, and after pawn takes knight, bishop takes, now Fischer would have his own weak pawns, and black would be doing fine here. So because of that, Fischer plays king to h1. Now that variation doesn't work because there would be no check when black takes on d4. Knight to d7 from Smyslov. The knight can come to c5, hitting the rook and putting its pressure back on e4. Bishop to e3 to control those key squares, particularly c5, keeps the knight out of c5. Rook to d8, doubling on the d file. The knight will move at some point, obviously, and then those rooks will gain power. h3 from Fischer. This stops any back rank threats. h6 from Black, not about the back rank, but about keeping pieces out of the g5 square. Now Fischer doubles on the a file. So Fischer has accentuated his strength on the a file. Smyslov has accentuated his strength on the d file. Knight d to b8 kicks the rook and also defends this knight at c6. The rook goes to a8. Now rook to d1 check, king to h2, and a pair of rooks come off of the board. But with each piece exchange, these pawns grow more vulnerable. Knight to d7 and b4. Again, keeping the knight out of c5 and fixing this b5 pawn as a weakness. Fischer wants to go to work on this pawn combined with pressure against this knight and also pressure against this c7 pawn is sort of where he can work. Now, Smyslov plays king to f7. Now, we ask ourselves the basic strategic question, known as Makaganov's rule, which is, we need to improve our worst placed piece. You know, if there's no way to advance your position that's obvious, you got to improve your worst placed piece. What is White's worst placed piece? What is Fischer's worst placed piece? Well, it turns out this knight at g3, again, because of these doubled pawns, doesn't have much to do. So Fischer begins to reroute the g3 knight. He goes to f1. Bishop to d6. Smyslov has to make sure this pawn at e5 is overprotected. He has it protected with 3 pieces at the moment. Otherwise, Fischer might capture it. g3, knight f6, applying immediate pressure to the e4 pawn. Knight 1 to d2. And this might seem like a bit of an equal standoff, but because of Smyslov's weak pawns, Fischer has all of the chances. King to e7, rook to a6, going back, hitting that knight. The knight goes to b8, hitting the rook, but now rook to a5, putting immediate pressure on the pawn at b5. If knight to c6, he would just lose his pawn, obviously. He has to defend that pawn. So c6. This move does defend b5, but it further limits Black's pieces. Now this knight doesn't have access to the square c6, which is its best square in this position. So step by step, Fischer is incrementally improving his position and weakening Black's. King to g2, knight b to d7, king to f1, bringing the king to the center of the action. Rook to c8. So Smyslov wants to trade off pieces. If he can trade off all the queenside pawns, I should say, his chances of drawing increase greatly. One of the things you do when you're worse in an endgame, you want to exchange off as many pawns as possible. That's one less pawn your opponent can use to promote. So he would like to play c5 and liquidate all of these queenside pawns. Fischer plays knight to e1 with the intention of going to d3 and keeping that c5 square under control. At the moment, he can't play c5 because of rook takes b5. So it doesn't work just yet. So knight to e8 is played with the idea of moving the knight to c7, where it defends b5, and then he can play c5, right? So that's his goal, is to trade off those queenside pawns. Fischer plays knight to d3, not only keeping this c5 square under some control, but also applying another attacker. Well, actually, it's the first attacker at the moment, to e5, but it won't be the last attacker, I can assure you. Knight to c7. Smyslov is preparing the c5 push. So what does Fischer do? He plays c4 first, before Smyslov is able to play c5. And notice this knight at d3 also defends b4. I didn't point that out, helping this c4 push be played. Pawn takes, knight takes c4. So now there are 2 knights attacking the c5 pawn. There's some pressure against the bishop at d6. It's defended by the king, but that's a tactically sensitive situation. Knight to b5 from Black defends the bishop. Rook to a6. Put some pressure on the c6 pawn with the idea of the knight going to a5, adding a second attacker to that pawn. Now king to f6. So after king to f6, how does Fischer build up pressure against this pawn at e5? It's defended twice by this knight and bishop. It's attacked twice. Actually, it's defended 3 times, excuse me, because the king also defends it. How does Fischer build up pressure on that pawn? Bishop to c1. The idea of moving this bishop to b2 to directly aim at that pawn, and then even f4 could be played because there will be a pin on that diagonal. Bishop to b8. Smyslov, I think, would like to play bishop to a7 and bishop to d4, but that takes a couple of moves, and bishop to b2 is played. He doesn't have time to do that. Smyslov plays c5, trying to continue the liquidation of pawns, but now that's a tactical problem for him. And Fischer is able to exploit that with this very nice move, knight to b6, hitting the rook, hitting the knight, really forcing him to play knight takes knight, knight b6, rook b6, and now Smyslov has a big problem. This rook is attacking the knight at b5, and it's very difficult to move that. If he moves the knight, then Fischer just takes the c5 pawn, and that will probably be it. So Smyslov plays c4, counterattacking the knight at d3, but then knight to c5 is played, and here Smyslov plays c3, and in this position, he resigned. Now, why would black resign here? Well, basically all Fischer has to do is play bishop to c1, and his threats are overwhelming, and there's nothing black can do about them. The threat is basically to win the knight at b5. If black saves that knight, it allows rook takes bishop, rook takes rook, knight to d7 check, forking the king and the rook. So the threat to the knight combined with the threat of rook takes bishop and forking on d7, and Smyslov resigned in this position. Really interesting to see how Fischer was able to exploit those weaknesses. In the end, the pawns still stand. They weren't captured, but they were used as a lever to get his positions into the best place possible for the win. Hope you've enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.